When I was 8 years old, I'd never really had any traumas in my life, no traumatic injuries of any sort. My younger brother had gotten stitches when he was 4, my older sister when she was 9 had broken her arm, but me, I'd never had anything other than the scraped knees and elbows that kids get from roller skates and bikes. The summer that I was 8, though, I got my first emergency room visit. It started on a hot day in July when we were going to an amusement park near our house, Geauga Lake, with my grandmother and her friend and the friend's grandchildren. This was exciting for a lot of reasons. We'd been to Cedar Point in Sandusky several times before, but we had not really been to Geauga Lake except once when I was a lot younger. So it was exciting to go there then. But it was also exciting because we were going without our parents and because we had friends with us. The older boy, James, was about 12, and my sister was 11 at the time, and the girl was 7. I was 8, my brother was 7. Annie, the little girl, was my ride partner for the day. We were really excited about everything. As soon as we got to the park, my sister and James took off for the roller coasters because they were big kids and far too cool to hang out with us little kids. My grandmother's friend went with them, and my grandmother stuck with me, my brother, and Annie. We spent the morning going on a lot of kiddie rides, but we weren't allowed to play any games until later in the day. So we were going on all these rides, and there was one ride in particular that we thought was awesome. It was called the Caterpillar, and like many children's roller coasters and such, it really didn't do much. It was little more than an oval track that went up and down a little bit, the slightest amount. But to us, this was cool. And we went on it with our arms in the air, screaming, and then as we went around turns, we did sideways, and we had a blast. Well, on one of these turns, Annie and I were in the same car, my brother was behind us, and our arms were sideways as we went around, and before I knew it, my hand had slipped under the ride, and it was crushed between the wheel of the ride and the track. As you can imagine, this hurt a lot, but I pulled my hand up and I stared at it. I didn't really know what to make of it, and it looked really gross. There was blood, there was skin hanging off, and it was a really dark, dirty color from the wheels, and as I held it in front of my face, I simply stared. I didn't really know what had happened, and it wasn't until Annie started screaming next to me that I even really realized the reality of the situation. And because of her screams, they had changed, obviously, from amusement to utter terror, the ride attendant noticed, and he stopped the ride. He came running over to us, and he pulled up the bar from my lap and pulled me out of the ride by my arm. Before I knew it, we were out through the gate and running, with him pulling me along by my arm, and I freaked. I had no idea what was going on. I mean, at 8 years old, stranger danger is one of those main phrases that you learn. And this strange man was pulling me along by the arm with no explanation whatsoever. He barely even spoke to me. I started crying, I want my grandma, and I didn't know it, but she was right behind us, hot on our heels. And he took me to the first aid station. In there was a nice woman who tried to calm me down, and before I even knew anything, my grandmother was there. And she was able to at least somewhat mollify my screams. And after that, I seemed to realize that, well, my hand was hurt. They dipped my hand in iodine, I remember, and it just looked so cute. It was orange, and smelled funny, and that was when I noticed that the rings I had been wearing that day on my 2 fingers were crushed into my skin, and almost like a part of my hand. They were cheap metal, plastic type rings. I don't quite recall the style. I remember one had a little heart and the other was some sort of braided thing, but to me they were valuable. and I was more concerned about my rings than about my hand for a few moments. Um, and so they determined at the first aid station that my hand was not broken. She couldn't detect any broken bones, but I was told I needed to go to the emergency room right away, and so they wrapped my hand up to about 3 times its normal size, and then I started crying again because I wasn't going to get to play any games. So my grandmother, to try and calm me down a little bit, let me play a few games before us taking off. She left Annie and my brother with her friend to finish out the day at Geog Lake and proceeded to take me home. As soon as we got home, my mother was first shocked and then livid. She was so angry with my grandmother for a number of reasons, really. The first being that my grandmother had been watching me at the time, or that I was in my grandmother's care when this happened. The second being that my mom was convinced that my grandmother bringing me home before taking me to the emergency room was a massive mistake. My mom was sure that I was going to get some sort of infection or injury just because of the fact that there was lag time between the injury and the emergency room visit. So my mom sent my grandmother away, and we went off to the emergency room, her and my father and I, and we were seated very quickly and dealt with, and I was taken into a room with 8 beds in it, and I was put into bed number 7, thinking that this was very lucky. And after determining that indeed there were no broken bones, the nurse in the hospital had to cut my rings off of my hand, which made me cry more than the injury because, at 8 years old, jewelry is all a girl has. And so after that, they had to do some stitches on my hand because around this area here was the worst, and the skin was hanging grossly, and they had to give me 8 stitches. Well, to do this, they had to stick needles into my hand in order to numb it. And as they did this, my father, who was sitting in a stool with wheels, began to sway slightly. My dad, who works at a factory and has seen any number of gory injuries from machinery, began to sway at the sight of a needle going into his daughter's hand. My mom offered to switch chairs with him since hers was stationary, but he denied it. And then, before they even had stuck the second needle into my hand, Daddy went down. My father passed out in the emergency room. Some nurses and doctors and whoever was around helped pick him up and put him into the bed next to me, bed number 8, and tried to rouse him. I remember him being very angry about the whole situation, probably more from embarrassment than anger, really. And then they gave him orange juice, which was a big mistake because my father has acid reflux and can't drink orange juice. And he just became even angrier at that. But so they proceeded to do my stitches with my dad in the bed next to us, the curtain pulled so he couldn't quite see what they were doing to my hand, and finished up bandaging me. Again, I had a giant hand, and I remember being very concerned about the fact that I was supposed to start 3rd grade in just about a month, and I wanted to make sure that I was going to have my hand back by then, which I was. But in the process of healing, I lost a fingernail. This one, it grew back. But I lost a fingernail, but at the same time, I healed perfectly fine. My hand is back to normal. And I also got to mark that off of my life's calendar that I had my own childhood injury to talk about.